The water came up to her knees before anyone realized how bad it was going to get. That night in the small town of Millbrook, Tennessee, a young woman named Grace Bennett ran barefoot through a flooded street to save a woman she had never even met. Nobody else moved. Nobody else tried. And on the other side of that flooded road, sitting quietly in the back of a black car, a man watched her do it, and he whispered 5 words to himself that he had been carrying for 3 years. It's still her, after everything. If you've ever wondered whether one small act of kindness could change the entire direction of someone's life, stay with us. Because what happened next in Millbrook would expose a secret 3 years in the making, a stranger with a hidden agenda, and a truth about who really deserves to be loved. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. It was late September, and the rain had not stopped for 2 days. Millbrook was a town most people drove past without noticing, a handful of streets, one diner, a church with a bell that hadn't rung properly since 1998, and a creek that usually stayed exactly where it belonged. That night, it didn't. The creek rose so fast that by 9 o'clock, water was pushing through front doors on Maple Street. Families grabbed what they could and ran for higher ground. Somewhere in the chaos, an elderly woman named Miss Odessa Grant, blind since her 60s and living alone since her husband passed, was still inside her house when the porch began to buckle. Grace heard her screaming before she saw the house. She didn't stop to think. She didn't wait for someone braver or stronger to go first. She waded into water that was already past her waist, pushed open a door that the flood was fighting to keep shut, and carried Miss Odessa out on her back through water that could have swept them both away. Ask yourself something for a moment. If you saw someone in danger and no one else was moving to help, would you be the one who ran toward it, or the one who filmed it from a safe distance? Grace didn't think about the answer. She just became it. Across the road, in a car that had no business being on a flooded street that night, a man named Ethan Cole sat perfectly still. His driver asked if they should turn back. Ethan didn't answer right away. He was watching a girl in a soaked yellow dress carry a stranger through water up to her chest, and something inside his chest cracked open in a way it hadn't in 3 years. "Drive," he finally said. "Not yet, just watch a little longer." To understand why that moment meant so much to Ethan, you first need to understand who Grace Bennett actually was, long before he ever knew her name. Grace was 24 years old. She had grown up in a small yellow house on the edge of town with her grandmother, Nana Ruth, after her parents died in a car accident when she was 9. She never finished college, not because she wasn't smart enough, but because there was never enough money, and Nana Ruth's knees had gotten too bad for her to keep working the way she used to. So Grace worked. She sold vegetables at the Saturday market. She tutored the neighborhood kids for free after school because their parents couldn't afford anyone else. She sang in the church choir every Sunday, not because she wanted to be seen, but because it was the 1 hour of the week that felt like peace. People in Millbrook loved her, but almost nobody knew how close she and Nana Ruth actually were to losing everything. There's a version of this story where Grace complains about her life. This isn't that story. Grace rarely complained, not out loud anyway. But late at night, lying in a bed with a mattress that had seen better decades, she would stare at the ceiling and wonder if she would spend her whole life exactly where she started. Have you ever had a night like that, where you worked as hard as you possibly could and it still didn't feel like enough? One afternoon, a group of children from the market came to her stall hungry, the kind of hungry that isn't about missing lunch, but about missing lunch 3 days in a row. Grace didn't have much. She had one small bag of rice she'd been saving to feed herself and her grandmother that night. She split it among the children without a second of hesitation and went home to boil water and pretend she wasn't hungry. She had no idea that a man in a parked car across the street had just watched her do it. 3 years before that flood, Ethan Cole was already one of the wealthiest men in the state, the kind of success story local news outlets loved to profile. What most of those stories never mentioned was the reason his charity work had become so obsessive, or why he flew back to a small town like Millbrook every few months when he had no business reason to be there at all. 8 years earlier, Ethan's younger sister, Sarah, had drowned in a flash flood not unlike the one that hit Millbrook that September night. She was 17. Ethan was 22, already working 80-hour weeks trying to build the company that would eventually make him rich, too busy, too far away, too late to reach the phone when she called him for help. Nobody came for her in time. He never forgave himself for that, and in a strange way, he never planned to. So when he saw a stranger in a small town give away her only food to hungry children without blinking, it didn't just move him. It undid something in him. He saw, in one small act, the exact kind of person the world needed more of, and the exact kind of help his sister never got. From that day on, Ethan quietly began paying attention to Grace's life. Not in a way that felt intrusive to her, because she never knew. He funded a scholarship fund that happened to cover her cousin's school fees. He arranged, through people who never used his name, for the church roof to be repaired the same month it had started leaking on the choir. When Nana Ruth needed a minor surgery 2 years earlier, an anonymous donor covered the bill in full. He asked himself constantly whether he should just tell her who he was. His assistant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya, asked him the same thing more than once. "Why don't you just tell her, Ethan? Walk up, introduce yourself, take her to dinner." His answer was always some version of the same sentence. "Because the last woman I let get close only loved what was in my bank account. I'd rather be nobody to her than be the wrong kind of somebody." Here's a question worth sitting with. If you had the ability to change someone's life completely, but you were terrified they would only value you for what you could give them, would you still show yourself? Or would you stay hidden and keep helping quietly? There's no easy answer to that. Ethan didn't have one either. He just kept choosing distance, year after year, convincing himself that distance was kindness. 2 months before the flood, a man named Victor Hale arrived in Millbrook. He said he was a land surveyor doing consulting work for the county. He was polished, well-spoken, always dressed a little nicer than the occasion called for, and within a week, half the town had decided he was the most charming man they'd met in years. He didn't rush anything. He started small, helping Grace carry crates at the market, fixing a fence for one of the older church members, showing up early to help set chairs before Sunday service. Slowly, carefully, he made himself impossible to dislike. Even Nana Ruth, who trusted almost no one on instinct, started to warm to him. Victor began spending time with Grace specifically. Coffee after church. Walks along the creek before it had flooded. He asked thoughtful questions and remembered small details about her life, the kind of attention that felt, to a woman who had spent years taking care of everyone else, like being seen for the first time in a long time. What Grace didn't know, and what none of Millbrook knew, was that Victor had done his research long before he ever set foot in town. Buried in county property records was a forgotten parcel of land registered under Nana Ruth's late husband's name, 17 acres that bordered the new interstate expansion route the state had quietly approved the year before. Developers were already circling the area. That land, worthless to anyone who didn't know what was coming, was about to be worth more than anyone in Millbrook could imagine. Victor wasn't interested in Grace. He was interested in getting close enough to that land to make sure it ended up in his hands before anyone else figured out what it was worth. If you've ever trusted someone because they said all the right things at exactly the right moments, you already understand how easily this kind of thing can happen to good, careful people. Grace wasn't naive. She was just someone who had spent her whole life giving people the benefit of the doubt, because that was the only way she knew how to live. The night of the storm, Victor wasn't thinking about Grace at all. While she was pulling Miss Odessa out of a collapsing house, he was 2 streets over, inside Nana Ruth's home, using the chaos of the flood as cover to search through an old wooden trunk in the back bedroom. He found what he was looking for: property deeds, a hand-drawn map from decades earlier, a letter written by Grace's late grandfather, predicting almost exactly what the interstate expansion would eventually confirm. Victor photographed every page with his phone, careful, quick, methodical, and slipped back out into the rain before anyone returned. He didn't know that a neighbor across the street, a retired mechanic named Walt who couldn't sleep because of his bad hip, had noticed a flashlight moving inside a house that should have been empty during a flood evacuation, and had quietly taken a video on his phone without fully understanding what he was looking at yet. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan had finally stepped out of the car. He didn't approach Grace that night. He wasn't ready, and honestly, neither was the moment. But he stayed close enough, coordinating quietly with local rescue crews, making sure Miss Odessa got to the hospital immediately, making sure Grace and Nana Ruth had somewhere safe and dry to go once the water receded. By morning, Millbrook was exhausted, soaked, and grateful to be alive. Nobody yet knew how much had changed in a single night. 3 days after the flood, Nana Ruth collapsed in the kitchen. Her heart, weakened for years, finally gave out under the stress of the storm and the cleanup that followed. Grace rode in the ambulance holding her grandmother's hand, praying in a way she hadn't prayed since her parents died. The doctor's words were the kind that stopped time. Nana Ruth needed emergency surgery, and without it, she likely wouldn't survive the month. The cost of that surgery was more money than Grace had ever seen in her life, let alone had access to. She sat in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself cry without trying to stop it. What would you do in that moment? If the person who raised you, who gave up everything so you could have a life, was running out of time, and the only thing standing between her and survival was money you didn't have? Grace didn't know that 2 floors away, Ethan Cole was already on the phone with the hospital administrator, arranging for the surgery to proceed immediately, all costs covered, no name attached to the payment. It was the same quiet pattern he had followed for 3 years. Help, then disappear before anyone could trace it back to him. This time, though, the pattern broke. A young billing clerk, new to the hospital and unaware of the arrangement Ethan usually insisted on, mentioned it casually to Grace at the front desk. "You're all set. Mr. Cole already covered everything, the surgery, the room, all of it." Grace froze. "Who?" she asked. "Ethan Cole," the clerk repeated, checking her screen. "He does this sometimes for families in town. I just assumed you knew him." Grace didn't know him, not really. She had seen his name on a plaque outside the community center once. That was all. Grace spent the next 2 days doing something she had never had a reason to do before, asking questions about her own life. She talked to the church pastor about the roof repairs from 2 years earlier and learned, for the first time, that the anonymous donor behind them had insisted on a single condition, that his name never be mentioned. She talked to her cousin about the scholarship that had quietly appeared out of nowhere during her hardest semester. She talked to the contractor, who had fixed Nana Ruth's roof after a storm the previous year. Every thread led to the same place, Ethan Cole. For 3 years, a man she barely knew had been quietly rebuilding pieces of her life every time they broke, asking for nothing in return, never once stepping forward to be thanked. Grace sat with that realization for a long time, not because it scared her, but because it made her ask a question she hadn't expected to ask herself. Had she ever actually noticed him? Really noticed him? And then she remembered. Almost every morning for the past 3 years, when she walked past the small cafe on 4th Street on her way to the market, there had been a man sitting near the window with coffee he barely touched. She'd seen him so many times that she'd stopped seeing him at all, the way you stop noticing a streetlight you pass every single day. Have you ever realized, looking back, that someone had been quietly present in your life for years, and you simply hadn't looked closely enough to see it? That is exactly where Grace found herself, sitting in a hospital chair, holding a truth she wasn't sure what to do with yet. While Grace was piecing together Ethan's secret, Walt the mechanic finally worked up the courage to show his neighbors the video he'd taken the night of the flood, the flashlight moving through Nana Ruth's supposedly empty house. Combined with a few other small details, a stranger asking unusually specific questions at the county records office, a phone call overheard by the church secretary about the interstate parcel. It didn't take long for people to connect Victor's charm to something far less innocent. Grace confronted him in the middle of the town square, in front of nearly everyone who had once welcomed him with open arms. She didn't yell. She simply asked him directly whether any of it had been real, the walks, the conversations, the attention. Victor, cornered and out of options, finally admitted the truth. "I never loved you, Grace. I needed access to that land, and you were the easiest way in." The square went silent. People who had defended him days earlier looked away in embarrassment. Nana Ruth, recovering but present, finally shared the last piece of the puzzle from her hospital bed days later. Her late husband hadn't stumbled onto that land by accident. He had predicted the town's expansion decades earlier and had gone through the effort of legally protecting the parcel so it could never be taken through a technicality or a con. Victor's entire plan collapsed the moment a lawyer confirmed the land was airtight, untouchable, and entirely Grace's family's to keep. If you've ever been deceived by someone who seemed too good to be true, you already know that the hardest part usually isn't losing them. It's realizing how much of yourself you handed over based on a version of them that never actually existed. Nana Ruth survived the surgery. 2 weeks later, with her grandmother stable and recovering at home, Grace finally walked into the small cafe on 4th Street, the one she had passed 1,000 times without truly seeing. Ethan was there, exactly where he always was, coffee cooling in front of him. She sat down across from him without asking permission. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why did you spend 3 years helping someone who didn't even know your name?" Ethan was quiet for a moment before he answered. "Because I noticed you," he said. "Once, a long time ago, in a way I couldn't explain and didn't feel ready to act on. And once I started paying attention, I couldn't stop caring what happened to you, even when I told myself I was keeping my distance for the right reasons." He told her about his sister for the first time, about the flood that took her, about the guilt that had shaped nearly every decision he'd made since. Grace listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she didn't offer pity. She simply said, "You didn't have to hide all of it to be someone worth knowing." That sentence stayed with him longer than almost anything else anyone had ever said to him. Grace and Ethan didn't rush into anything. There was no dramatic proposal, no sudden transformation of her life overnight. What there was, instead, was time, honest conversation, and a relationship built slowly enough that neither of them ever had to wonder if it was real. Months later, the land that Victor had tried to steal became the foundation for something neither Grace nor Ethan expected. Together, using part of the settlement from the eventual development deal, they funded a full renovation of the Millbrook School, a new wing at the community hospital, and a scholarship fund with Sarah Cole's name on it, so that Ethan's sister would finally be remembered for more than the way she was lost. Nana Ruth got to see all of it. She often said, sitting on her porch with her tea, that the flood took almost everything from that town for one terrible night and somehow gave it back everything it needed in the months that followed. People in Millbrook stopped talking about Ethan's money after a while. They started talking about the fact that a stranger had quietly shown up for a town that had nothing to offer him back for 3 years without ever asking for credit. And Grace, the young woman who once gave away her last bit of food without hesitation, finally understood something she hadn't fully believed before that flood. That the people who love you the most don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes, they simply stay close, year after year, waiting patiently for you to finally look their way. So here's the question we'll leave you with today. Somewhere in your own life, right now, there might be someone quietly showing up for you in ways you haven't fully noticed yet. A friend, a neighbor, a family member, someone who has never once asked to be thanked. Who is that person for you? And have you told them lately what they mean to you? If this story moved you even a little, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story.